former employees of Anadarko Petroleum Corporation have come forward to describe a culture of corporate callousness that puts profits before safety. 6 people who used to work for the company say it created massive risks before one of its leaking pipelines caused an explosion in Firestone, killing 2 and injuring another in April 2017. Susan Greene of the Colorado Independent says the disclosures were made in a case that was filed by shareholders alleging that the company created a ticking time bomb in its Colorado operations.
The lawsuit was actually filed a couple weeks after the explosion. So that was in May. The explosion was in April 2017, and it was filed in May 2017. What I heard about was that there had been an amended complaint in that class action that was more specific than the first. And what really caught my attention is that it relied on information provided by the longtime and very well-known chief lobbyist for Anadarko, Castilian, and also information from the company's longtime and well-known as well spokeswoman, Olsen.
And what was the central complaint in this class action lawsuit?
It's a shareholders lawsuit. So after the explosion, the company's stock really plummeted with information about its failure to protect citizens and failure to protect that neighborhood from that kind of explosion and failure really to remediate or repair these old wells that are all entwined now in new development. So the shareholders, having lost a lot of the value of their stock, sued the company for not being forthcoming about the threats that infrastructure posed.
Now, you spoke with Castilian, who is Anadarko's former longtime government relations chief in Colorado. What did he have to say?
He had to say a number of things. Number one, that he quit his job because he could no longer in good conscience represent that company. He had sat in too many executive and leadership meetings in which, after the safety folks and the engineers had repeatedly called the top executives' attention to all these old and deteriorating wells that Anadarko had acquired in a land swap with Noble Energy in 2013. And they said, we really need you to pay attention and clean these things up and fix them. That the top executives who were heading the company ignored them, essentially, and decided, instead of using that money to remediate those wells, to use them toward production and or to only remediate wells that were in production. And these were decisions that were made because the prices of oil and gas really plummeted in 2014 and 2015. So whereas the company used to have plenty of money to devote to both safety and production, they were making these decisions much more on the production side, regardless of the safety threats posed in an area that, again, as I said, in which, a lot of these wells were drilled about 30 and 40 years ago in Weld County. And since then, especially even since the land was acquired by Anadarko in 2013, neighborhoods, whole communities have built up around these. And there's been a real disregard from the company about the intersection of this old leaking infrastructure or these flow lines. In this case, in this home, it was a flow line that ran from an old well right up to where the house was built. And this is underground. You can't see it. And it wasn't capped. So when that well was turned on by the company, that flow line essentially took the methane and it leaked underground into this house, which caused this fatal explosion, which killed 2 men and critically injured one of their wives.
It sounds from what you've discovered with the lawsuit and speaking with former executives from Anadarko that this should not have come as a surprise, that there was an awareness that there were safety issues here in Colorado.
Absolutely. Chris mentioned a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that the executives had made of the most, I think they were calling it, risky and problematic wells. And it was a long one of hundreds of these wells. And he said a small portion of them were even inspected.
Put this in the context of what we have here in terms of regulation in Colorado, where many critics of our regulatory framework here say it's essentially a self-regulated industry, and the fact that the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission doesn't have the resources to adequately police and regulate all of this. What is the connection between the two?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's important to note that the COGCC, the commission that you just mentioned, one of its main primary responsibility when it was formed, and it still is to promote rather than really to regulate the oil and gas industry in the state. They have never seen, and there's currently a lawsuit at the state Supreme Court, a mandate. They don't have a legislative mandate or a legal mandate to put safety and environmental, meaning health safety and environmental safety, above boosting this industry. So that's a fundamental legal problem with that commission. Add to it the fact that we have a governor who's a former oil and gas geologist and a real champion of the industry. And that's a problem. In this case in particular, not only did Anadarko, when it inherited or acquired these flow lines in its land swap in 2013 with Noble Energy, they didn't know where a lot of these underground flow lines even were. And there's no requirement from state regulators that they, number one, even know where they are, number two, inspect them regularly. And even though there is a requirement that all abandoned flow lines need to be capped and inspected, and there are all manner of regulations, they're just absolutely not enforced. To make matters worse, there needn't be any disclosure in the regulatory scheme. There needn't be any disclosure to developers developing in this area, or to home buyers buying in this area, or renters renting in this area.
There have been efforts to introduce some form of legislation at a local level and at a state level, which have not really been successful given the history of oil and gas industry opposition to any type of regulatory legislation. But there have been some efforts to try and at least map some of these flow lines. And given the population expansion that we're seeing in all of these counties, particularly Weld County and northern Colorado, is there a sense in the industry and amongst people who are watching this that more accidents are coming?
Absolutely. I mean, the folks I spoke with one man literally said he's up at night and he has to take anxiety meds just thinking about how many sites his crews should have but didn't have the resources to inspect and remediate for Anadarko. I mean, it's interesting, what we've seen, and I've seen this in my coverage of cities and the military and everything, it's the people who work most closely in these industries who know really about the greatest risks or the greatest malfeasance going on at leadership, who are most vocal about it. And that's why I think this story is such a big one, is when you have the man who was the head lobbyist and government relations person, and the woman who was the spokeswoman for years for this company, coming out and saying, we put our reputations on the line for this company. And there was a social contract that when we joined this company, it had a real sense of commitment and responsibility to the communities where it was producing oil and gas. When they're saying that social contract is no longer warranted, that this company doesn't have credibility when it comes to that social contract or the safety and health, both environmental and human, to this community, that's huge. And that, I think, is the significance of what came out in this amended complaint of this lawsuit.
Well, Anadarko, the corporation themselves, they're certainly launching and have for over a year since the explosion in Firestone, a heavy PR campaign. And a lot of that is focused on CRED, and that is a PR group, Coloradans for Responsible Energy Development. And that's mainly funded by Anadarko and Noble Energy. And I'm sure listeners, if they've been watching any of the local television channels recently, will see these ads that talk about the safety of the oil and gas industry, their commitment to safety. Talk a little bit about CRED and its role in trying to take attention and deflect away from the reality of what's happening with drilling here along the Front Range.
Right. I mean, let's be clear about CRED. CRED is run by former journalists. It was founded by Chris Castilian, who is the person speaking out in my story, this former lobbyist. It's a propaganda machine. I mean, they would say it was created to let people know and inform Coloradans about how safe this technology is. But they'll also say it was formed when Jared Polis and environmentalists in 2014 were trying to pass statewide ballot initiatives for setbacks between homes and schools and oil and gas operations, and also promote local control so that municipalities could control the level of energy development in their communities. This is a propaganda and a political endeavor. And Chris Castilian himself, the head lobbyist for Anadarko, the public face of this company, formed that thing. And now he's saying, and let's be clear, CRED, it's short for credibility. I mean, he's saying that this industry, this company, not this industry, Anadarko, which was bankrolling him, it was his actual employer, no longer has credibility. So, this is all around us. It's on the buses that we're behind in traffic. It's on our radio when we're listening to football games. These ads are not only on television, but they're all around us, and they are propaganda. And what he's saying so interestingly is no matter how much money they put into these things, no matter how many parades they sponsor for Juneteenth or Cinco de Mayo, no matter how many TV buys they make, if they don't have this basic credibility, this trust that they're meeting their side of this social contract with communities in a state that allows them to do business here, those ads won't work.
And in terms of what's happening here in the state, of course, Jared Polis is one of the gubernatorial candidates. How big an issue is this in the gubernatorial race?
It hasn't, it's one of the issues that's being discussed along with many others, including Tabor and transportation and sexual harassment and, all the boilerplate issues that we discuss in this state. But, a real hard examination of the dark money and the influence of oil and gas money in the state. A real look, for example, at, Ken Salazar, who everybody expected to be running for governor until he decided not to, who has been working as a lawyer for Anadarko, and his endorsement recently of Kerry Kennedy. I mean, we can't ignore that there are these dynamics happening in our political landscape, and there is this propaganda all around us, and there are these newspapers that are dying, and that there aren't that many people really taking a real sober look at how much influence this industry has had. And we've had a governor for 8 years who, again, has been a real booster of this industry, who has really held back people like Polis from going for more regulation. I think, I would hope to see this percolating up as a major issue, not only in the primaries, but especially in the general election.
And in terms of the Firestone explosion itself, 2 people died, 1 person was horrifically injured. There is a lawsuit, but this lawsuit that we're talking about is about the loss of profits for shareholders. What about compensation for the family who lost those 2 people, for the woman who was severely burned, and for that entire neighbourhood who is traumatized from that explosion? Are there any other lawsuits happening?
Very much so, Maeve. There's litigation happening all over the place, not just against Anadarko, but also Noble Energy, because this infrastructure used to belong to them. There's all manner of lawsuits, including legal action, not necessarily filed, but that has been worked on, let's say, by attorneys for that family, of course. There's litigation all over the place. There are the people who are quoted in this amended complaint, including Chris Castilian and I believe Robin Olsen and others who we have not named, have been called and asked repeatedly to do the same type of testimony, or at least the same type of interview, and ultimately probably depositions in those cases.
Now, we talked about the gubernatorial race, but the state legislative session is in its final days now, and it seems like, once again, no legislation has gone through that in any way regulates the oil and gas industry. So in terms of dark money, that seems to be percolating everywhere around the state.
Yeah, we're so going to get slammed with dark money in this governor's race, Maeve. Colorado is a purple state, a swing state. This is a midterm election. How we vote in this election is being closely watched by both parties nationally and big donors nationally as a litmus or a bellwether for 2020. We are going to be bombarded, as we always are, but probably much more so this cycle, by dark money. There's no doubt that the oil and gas industry will be chiming in. There's no doubt that Anadarko will be chiming in. There's no doubt that we have a very impeded press corps right now with everything that's going on at the Post and the Daily Camera and other newspapers and media outlets around the state. There's a need for a real sober look, as I said, into this money, tracking this money, and the powers and influences behind this election.
Well, to that end, I know the Colorado Independent has been and will continue to closely follow the gubernatorial race, and we're very excited to be able to broadcast your podcast, which will be running over 10 weeks starting in September, focusing on a weekly basis on the gubernatorial race. We'll have more details as we get closer to that time. But in the meantime, we will have a link on our website to the Colorado Independent report by Susan Greene into Anadarko and the Firestone explosion and what that corporation knew in advance and what's happening now. Susan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Maeve, as always.